So when the Nintendo Switch 2 initially released, there was this big conspiracy theory from PC gamers like Review Tech USA and the like that were pushing this narrative that the games aren't selling, the hardware is going to be a failure. This is the end of Nintendo. Like this is the thing we see like every console generation, every single time they pull this nonsense, and every single time they are surprised when that turns out to be a complete and total farce, right? And we saw this with the Switch 2. A lot of people are noticing this, that the Switch 2 not only sold very, very well in spite of online complaints, it did very, very well. It became the fastest selling console ever. Like 10 million units sold in like 3 months. And I imagine by the end of the year, it's going to crack like 15, 17, 18 million, maybe as high as 20. We'll see. They haven't confirmed the new numbers yet, and they won't for quite some time. But this console is clearly a huge success. It's clearly selling. We're past the point where we can like concern troll about hardware sales, and so as they always do, game journos are now pivoting and trying to complain about software sales. They're trying to complain about games not selling well on Switch 2, especially third-party games. But the narrative right now is that everything other than Mario Kart World is a complete flop on Nintendo Switch 2. Donkey Kong Bonanza has only sold 3.5 million units, like completely underrepresenting the fact that the best-selling Donkey Kong game ever has only sold like what 9 million. Like Bonanza is on track to like outselling Donkey Kong Country Returns very quickly, becoming the highest-selling Donkey Kong game ever. So this concern trolling you're seeing in regards to Switch 2 sales numbers, like particularly when it comes to third party games, are just ridiculous. If you're a third party game, if you're a late port selling on Nintendo Switch 2 and selling like 500,000 units, that's a success. Like if you're a million seller, if you're like Street Fighter 6 or whatever, like that's success. The narrative that people have that for whatever reason that this is some epic failure on Nintendo's part, that Nintendo can't um succeed when it comes to selling software. It's just a giant cope. And I pointed this out too when it came to like Review Tech USA's version of events like months and months ago, how he's sitting there and trying to tell you that like third party games are doing badly on the platform. I pointed out like the obvious, like what third party games, and there are games on there that are successful. So basically, obviously not every game is going to be super successful on a new piece of hardware, but the simple fact of the matter is that if there are games on there that are successful, that are clearly doing well, like Mario Kart World and the like you can't really gaslight people into thinking that other successful games don't exist. Like that's just the reality of it. The cope that like Switch 2 games are just not doing well at all, that they're not keeping up with the pace of the hardware sales is just laughably stupid, especially when you take into consideration that Switch 1 games are calculated differently. They are not counted towards the full total of games sold on Nintendo Switch 2 because these are Switch 1 games. So, in my case, and I think in a lot of people's cases, like a lot of what people are buying are Switch 1 games. A lot of people are still picking up Switch 1 games and playing them on Switch 2. And so the entire narrative that there is nothing to play on Switch 2 and that nobody is buying games on Switch 2 just completely falls apart when you realize that the Switch 1 is still on the market and is still being sold and is still selling games. Like your entire supposition just completely collapses. And it is remarkable how long they've been trying to keep this farce going. This is something we've been dealing with since launch, actually a little bit beforehand. A lot of people gaslit themselves into thinking that the Switch 2 was going to fail or that it was too overpriced and the like, that it had no games. And yet, like, this thing was stupidly successful. Like, and what we're seeing now is just a very stubborn refusal from the community to acknowledge it. They are doing everything they possibly can to keep up the narrative that Nintendo is on the verge of failure. They really think that Nintendo is just going to go bust. because software sales aren't high enough. It's a joke. And it really should be thought of and treated as a joke. It's something that we really need to talk about more going forward, because there is no reason to assume that software is doing badly on Nintendo Switch 2 at this point in time. And yet you will continue to see this narrative being pushed, not only in regards to this specific situation, but in regards to the performance of the Mario movie, the Zelda movie, amiibo sales, and you may even see people start to question Switch 2 sales numbers. I covered a Reddit article a while back from some Nintendo hater that tried to suggest that the Nintendo Switch 2 sales could be fake, because it's simply not possible for a console this bad to sell this well. Like that's the mindset that a lot of these people have, is that like the Nintendo isn't successful because it's not possible for Nintendo to succeed. That's kind of the mindset that we see pretty consistently in the community, is just how obsessed they are at religiously hating Nintendo and everything they do. And it's something that really needs to be called out in the community. It's something that we need to address. It's something we need to nip in the bud like immediately at this early stage, because this is the same kind of thing that affected the Wii. You know, so many people gaslit themselves into thinking people just bought a Wii for Wii Sports and then never really touched again. It's not commonly understood that the Wii actually had a perfectly normal attach rate. It sold a bunch of software, and the cope has always been that that wasn't true, that it was just that it paled in comparison to the Xbox 360, but in reality the Wii was actually far more successful than both of them. So when you take that into consideration, when you notice things like that, like, it becomes impossible to take the game journal version of events seriously. Like, we have seen this song and dance played out time and time again over the past 25 years. And it's high time that we really start acknowledging the reality of the situation, is that this obsessive hatred towards Nintendo needs to stop. It's not getting you anywhere. You're making things up. You're misrepresenting the company, and you're doing everything you possibly can to avoid addressing the obvious, that Nintendo is extremely successful at what they do. And all of your copes to the contrary have just fallen apart. Not even in a matter of months, we're seeing the whole narrative that Switch 2 did not sell well, like, completely fall apart. Like, it's not something that the industry can continue to do going forward. And Nintendo fans absolutely need to call these people out. It has to happen yesterday. Thank you for watching.